When a dying mountain man spends his life savings on a little girl at a frontier auction, he expects to give her shelter for his final weeks. But nothing could prepare him for the moment. She looks up at him and whispers, "Papa." In the unforgiving wilderness of 1867 Dakota Territory, Bear McKenna will discover that some bonds transcend death itself, and that the greatest treasures are often found in the most unexpected places. But can a man who spent 20 years running from love learn to be a father before time runs out? The mountain lion's scream cut through the morning air like a knife through butter, sending every bird in the Dakota Territory forest into panicked flight. Jeremiah McKenna pressed his back against the rough pine bark, his heart hammering against his ribs as the big cat's golden eyes locked onto his from 30 feet away. This was not how he wanted to die. The November wind of 1867 whipped through the towering trees, carrying the smell of snow and something else, something that made Bear's chest tighten with more than just fear. He had been tracking this cat for 3 days, following its prints through rocky canyons and dense woods. The animal had been killing livestock near Broken Creek, and the townspeople were offering good money for its hide. But now, staring into those hungry yellow eyes, Bear wondered if the money would matter when he was dead. His rifle felt heavy in his shaking hands. The mountain lion crouched low, its muscles bunching under golden fur. Bear knew he had one shot before the cat would leap. One chance to live or die. The animal's tail twitched once, twice, then it sprang forward like lightning. Bear's finger found the trigger just as his world exploded into coughing. The sickness that had been growing in his chest for months chose that moment to attack, doubling him over as blood speckled his beard. The rifle shot went wild, the bullet striking a tree branch above the cat's head. The mountain lion landed hard, confused by the noise and the strange behavior of its prey. It circled Bear warily as he fought to breathe, each cough feeling like broken glass in his lungs. "Come on then," Bear wheezed, pulling his hunting knife from its sheath. "Let's finish this." But the cat had lost its taste for battle. It backed away slowly, then turned and bounded into the thick woods, leaving Bear alone with his rattling breath and the bitter taste of blood in his mouth. Bear leaned against the tree, closing his eyes as the coughing fit slowly passed. At 53, he had survived grizzly bears, winter storms, and angry Indians, but the consumption eating away at his lungs was an enemy he couldn't fight with knife or gun. He pulled out his pocket watch, a gift from his father 30 years ago. The gold was tarnished now, but it still kept perfect time. According to the doctor in Deadwood, Bear had maybe 2 months left, maybe less. The thought should have scared him. But mostly Bear felt tired of being alone, tired of waking up each morning in his empty cabin with nothing but silence for company, tired of remembering things he wanted to forget. He shouldered his rifle and started the long walk back to town. His boots crunched through the fallen leaves as he followed the winding trail down the mountainside. The trees here were ancient, some old enough to have been saplings when the first white men crossed these lands. Bear had always found comfort in their silent strength, but today they seemed to whisper of endings. Broken Creek came into view as he rounded a bend in the trail. The little town sat in a valley between 2 ridges, its wooden buildings huddled together like animals seeking warmth. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and Bear could see people moving about their daily business, the blacksmith working his forge, women hanging laundry, children playing in the dusty streets, normal people living normal lives, something Bear had never really understood. He had been a mountain man for 30 years, living alone in the wilderness, trading furs and hunting for bounties. It was a hard life, but it was his life, the only one he had ever wanted after. Bear pushed the memory away before it could take hold. Some doors were better left closed. As he walked down the town's main street, people nodded respectfully, but kept their distance. They knew Bear McKenna's reputation. He was fair in his dealings, but dangerous when crossed. Children peeked at him from behind their mother's skirts, wide-eyed at the sight of the legendary mountain man. Bear headed straight for the Silver Dollar Saloon, where he could usually find information about work. The bounty on the mountain lion would have to wait his coughing fit had probably scared the animal clear into the next territory. The saloon was dim and smoky, filled with the usual mix of cowboys, miners, and drifters. Bear ordered whiskey and found a corner table where he could watch the room. Old habits died hard, even when death was knocking at the door. "Heard you were tracking that cat," said a voice behind him. Bear turned to see Sheriff Coleman, a thin man with nervous eyes and a badge that seemed too big for his chest. Coleman had been trying to hire Bear for odd jobs ever since he'd arrived in Broken Creek 6 months ago. "Lost the trail," Bear lied smoothly. No need to admit he'd been too sick to finish the job. Coleman sat down without being invited. "Maybe that's for the best. Got something else that might interest you. Not looking for work right now." "This is different." Coleman leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Judge Morrison is holding one of his special auctions tomorrow. Debt collections, you understand. Sometimes a man with your skills, we might find an opportunity." Bear raised an eyebrow. Judge Morrison was known throughout the territory for his creative solutions to unpaid debts. When someone couldn't pay what they owed, Morrison would auction off their possessions, and sometimes their labor contracts, to settle the debt. It wasn't quite slavery, but it wasn't freedom either. "What kind of opportunity?" Bear asked, though he wasn't sure why he cared. "Word is there's a child involved this time. Little girl whose father died in a mining accident. No family to take her, and the town can't afford to keep her through winter. Morrison's looking for someone willing to take on a labor contract." Bear felt something cold settle in his stomach. A child? 7 years old? Maybe 8? Pretty little thing from what I hear. Someone with a cabin and the means to feed another mouth might find her useful. She's old enough to work, and Morrison's only asking for a $5 starting bid. The whiskey turned to acid in Bear's mouth. He had seen labor auctions before, desperate people selling years of their lives to pay off debts. But children were different. Children were when, he heard himself ask. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock sharp, Town Square." Coleman stood up, tipping his hat. "Just thought you might be interested. Man living alone up in those mountains could probably use some help around the place." Bear watched the sheriff walk away, then stared down into his whiskey glass. The amber liquid reflected his face, weathered skin, gray beard, green eyes that had seen too much. Not the face of a man who should be thinking about taking responsibility for a child, but something twisted in his chest that had nothing to do with the consumption. Maybe it was the thought of a little girl standing on an auction block, waiting to see who would buy her future. Maybe it was the memory of another child who had never gotten the chance to grow up. Or maybe it was just the whiskey. Bear finished his drink and walked out into the afternoon sun. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight, he had some thinking to do. The wooden auction block stood in Broken Creek's town square like a judgment seat, weathered by years of desperate transactions. Bear McKenna arrived early, positioning himself near the back of the growing crowd, where he could observe without being noticed. His leather coat hung loose on his frame. He had lost weight over the past months, as the sickness ate away at him from the inside. The November morning was crisp and clear, with frost still clinging to the wooden sidewalks. Bear's breath came out in small puffs as he watched the townspeople gather. There were ranchers looking for cheap labor, shopkeepers hoping to find help for their stores, and the usual collection of drifters and opportunists who showed up whenever human misery was for sale. Judge Morrison climbed onto the platform with his ledger book and gavel, his black robes making him look like a crow perched on a fence post. The judge was a thin man with sharp features and calculating eyes, the kind of person who could sleep soundly after destroying lives in the name of legal procedure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison's voice carried across the square, "we are here today to settle outstanding debts in accordance with territorial law. First item is a bay mare, 5 years old, to settle the gambling debts of one William Tucker." Bear barely paid attention as the horse was led out and sold to a cattle rancher for $15. His eyes were scanning the crowd, noting faces and calculating intentions. He recognized most of the bidders, men who worked their hired help hard and paid them little. The second item was a collection of mining tools and personal effects belonging to a man who had died of black lung. The tools went quickly to another miner, looking to expand his operation. Then Morrison consulted his ledger and cleared his throat. Next item requires some explanation. We have here 3 individuals whose circumstances have led them to this unfortunate situation. Bear's attention snapped to the platform as 3 figures were led up the wooden steps. The first was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and calloused hands, carrying a small carpet bag that probably contained everything she owned in the world. The second was a young man, maybe 20 years old, who kept his head down and his shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. The third was a little girl. Bear felt his breath catch in his throat. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, with dark hair that hung in tangled waves past her shoulders. Her dress had once been brown, but it was now patched with so many different fabrics that it looked like a quilt. In her small hands, she clutched a wooden toy horse, its paint worn away by countless touches. But it was her eyes that hit Bear like a punch to the gut. They were green, the same shade as his own, and filled with a calmness that no child should possess. She looked out at the crowd not with fear or confusion, but with a strange sort of patience, as if she had been expecting this moment her whole life. "The woman is Margaret Holloway," Morrison announced, consulting his papers. 43 years old, experienced in housekeeping and cooking. Her husband died owing $60 in medical bills. We're offering a 3-year labor contract to settle the debt. The bidding was brief and brutal. Margaret went to the owner of the boarding house for $22. As she was led away, she looked back once at the little girl on the platform, and Bear saw tears streaming down her face. "The young man is David Chen," Morrison continued, 21 years old, skilled in carpentry and general labor. Owes $45 in gambling debts. 5-year contract available. David was purchased by a rancher for $30. He walked off the platform without looking back, his shame evident in every step. That left only the child. Morrison opened his ledger to a fresh page and cleared his throat again. This is Elena Martinez. Age approximately 6 years. Her father, Carlos Martinez, died 3 weeks ago in a mining accident at the Broken Creek Silver Mine. He owed the company store $18 for supplies and medical care. The child's mother died 2 years previous of fever. No known relatives have come forward to claim her. Bear studied the little girl more closely. Elena Martinez. She stood perfectly still on the platform, her dark hair catching the morning sunlight. The wooden horse in her hands was carefully carved, with delicate features and flowing mane. Someone had loved her enough to make that toy with their own hands. "The territorial government cannot support orphan children indefinitely," Morrison was saying. "Therefore, we are offering a 7-year indenture contract. The successful bidder will be responsible for the child's care, education, and moral development. In return, she will provide household labor appropriate to her age and abilities." Bear felt sick to his stomach. 7 years. This little girl would be a teenager before she could call her life her own again, and judging by the men in the crowd, there was no guarantee she would be treated with kindness during those years. "Starting bid is $5, Morrison announced, raising his gavel. $5! Called out a voice from the front of the crowd. Bear recognized Henrik, the storekeeper, a man known for working his employees from dawn to dusk and paying them in store credit instead of real money. $7. This came from a rancher whose hired hands always seemed to disappear after a few months, usually sporting fresh bruises. Bear's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every instinct told him to walk away. He was a dying man with no business taking responsibility for a child. He had never been good with people, especially young ones. What did he know about raising a little girl? But Elena's green eyes swept across the crowd and somehow found his face in the back. For just a moment, their gazes met, and Bear felt something shift inside his chest. It wasn't the familiar pain of the consumption, it was something else entirely. Recognition. $10. The bid came from his own mouth before he realized he was speaking. The crowd turned to stare at him, surprise evident on every face. Bear McKenna, the legendary mountain man, bidding on a child? It was like watching a grizzly bear trying to knit a scarf. $12. Henrik called out, shooting a dark look in Bear's direction. Bear stepped forward through the crowd, his imposing frame causing people to move aside without thinking. Even weakened by illness, he still commanded respect through sheer presence. $15, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the square. A murmur ran through the crowd. $15 was serious money enough to feed a family for months or buy a decent saddle horse. Henrik hesitated, clearly calculating whether the investment was worth it. The rancher who had been bidding seemed to have lost interest entirely. $20, Bear announced, reaching into his leather pouch and pulling out a handful of silver coins. The metal caught the sunlight as he held them up for everyone to see. The crowd fell silent. $20 for an indenture contract was unheard of, especially for a child who couldn't do much more than simple household tasks. Morrison looked around the square, his gavel raised. $20. Going once, going twice. Bear kept his eyes fixed on Elena throughout the bidding. She hadn't moved or changed expression, but something in her gaze seemed to intensify as his bid stood unchallenged. Sold. Morrison's gavel came down with a sharp crack. Elena Martinez, 7-year indenture contract, to Jeremiah McKenna for $20. As Bear walked forward to complete the transaction, he wondered what in God's name he had just done. He was a dying man who lived alone in a cabin miles from civilization. He knew nothing about caring for children, especially little girls. This was probably the most foolish thing he had ever done in a life filled with questionable decisions. But when he reached the platform and looked up at Elena, she smiled for the first time since he had seen her. It was a small smile, barely visible, but it transformed her entire face. Suddenly, she looked less like a solemn little adult and more like the child she actually was. "Hello," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the crowd noise. "Hello, Elena," Bear replied, surprised by how gentle his own voice sounded. "Are you ready to come down from there?" She nodded and walked to the edge of the platform. Bear reached up and lifted her down, startled by how light she was. Up close, he could see that her clothes were clean, but worn thin, and her dark hair had leaves and twigs caught in it, as if she had been sleeping outdoors. Morrison approached with his ledger and a satisfied smile. $20, Mr. McKenna, plus a 50-cent processing fee. The contract is for 7 years, with the understanding that you will provide food, shelter, clothing, and basic education. The child may not be sold or transferred to another party without court approval. Bear counted out the coins, watching his life savings shrink to almost nothing. $20.50 represented weeks of careful hunting and trapping. But as he looked down at Elena, who was now standing quietly beside him while still clutching her wooden horse, he found he didn't regret the expense. "The paperwork will be ready this afternoon," Morrison continued. "You can pick it up at my office any time after 3 o'clock. Bear nodded and turned to leave, then hesitated. "Elena, do you have anything else? Any belongings we need to collect?" She shook her head, holding up the wooden horse. "Just Estrella." "Estrella? My horse. Papa made her for me before." She trailed off, but Bear understood. As they walked away from the auction block, Bear became aware of the whispers following them. The townspeople were clearly puzzled by his unexpected purchase. Jeremiah McKenna, the hermit mountain man, taking responsibility for a child? It was the most surprising thing to happen in Broken Creek since the silver mine had first been discovered. Elena walked beside him without complaint, her small legs working hard to match his longer stride. When Bear noticed she was struggling to keep up, he slowed his pace without comment. "Are you hungry?" he asked as they passed the general store. Elena nodded, then seemed to catch herself. "A little, but I don't want to be trouble." Something twisted in Bear's chest at those words. How many times had this child been told she was trouble? How often had she learned to minimize her own needs to avoid being a burden? "You're not trouble," he said firmly. "And we're going to get you something to eat." They stopped at the store, where Bear purchased basic supplies for the journey to his cabin: flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, and a small bag of hard candy that he slipped into his coat pocket when Elena wasn't looking. As they prepared to leave town, Bear found himself wondering what he was going to do with a 6-year-old girl in a cabin built for one. He had no idea how to braid hair or mend dresses or answer the 1,000 questions that children always seem to have. But when Elena looked up at him with those remarkable green eyes and smiled again, Bear decided that maybe not knowing was okay. Maybe they would figure it out together. After all, he had nothing but time. Well, at least a few weeks of it. "Papa." The single word hit Bear McKenna like a lightning bolt as he knelt beside the wagon outside Broken Creek. His hands froze on the rope he was tying, and the world seemed to tilt sideways. Elena stood 3 feet away, her green eyes looking directly into his, and Bear felt like he was drowning in memories he had buried 20 years ago. "What did you say?" His voice came out as barely a whisper. Elena tilted her head, studying his face with the serious expression of someone much older than her 6 years. "Papa, that's what Mama told me to call you when I found you." Bear's legs gave out completely. He sank to his knees in the dusty street, staring at this impossible child who had just turned his world upside down. The other townspeople walking by gave them curious looks, but Bear couldn't have cared less about their stares. "Elena," he managed to say, "what was your mama's name?" "Martha Rose Martinez," she replied without hesitation. "But before she married my other papa, Carlos, her name was Martha Rose Sullivan. She said you would remember her hair. It was yellow like corn silk, and she used to braid flowers into it during summer." The wagon wheel Bear had been working on might as well have been on another planet. His mind raced backward through time to a small cabin by a mountain stream, to a young woman with laughing blue eyes and hair like spun gold. Martha had been the only person who ever made him believe he could be something more than a rough mountain man. "She died having our baby," Bear said slowly, the words feeling like broken glass in his throat. "The doctor said, both of them." Elena shook her head firmly. "Mama didn't die then. She said she almost did, but something made her fight harder. She said she had to live long enough to make sure I found my real papa someday." Bear's hands shook as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his father's brass compass. The metal was warm from being close to his body, and the tiny engraving on the back caught the afternoon sunlight. He held it out to Elena with trembling fingers. "Did your mama ever tell you about this?" Elena's eyes widened as she took the compass. Her small fingers traced the engraved letters J, M, forever yours, M, R. And when she looked back up at Bear, tears were streaming down her cheeks. "She said you gave this to her the night before you had to go away on a long trapping expedition. She said it would always point her toward home, and someday it would point me toward you." Elena's voice was steady despite her tears. "She kept it under her pillow every night until she went to heaven 2 years ago." Bear felt like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart with an iron fist. 20 years ago, he had left Martha safe in their cabin while he went on what was supposed to be a month-long trapping run. When he returned, he found the cabin empty, except for a note from Doc Henderson, saying Martha had taken fever and died, along with their unborn child. He had never questioned it, never looked deeper. He had been so destroyed by grief that he sold the cabin and disappeared into the mountains, becoming the hermit everyone now knew as Bear McKenna. But if Elena was telling the truth, how? He whispered. How did she survive? Where did she go? Elena sat down in the dirt beside him, carefully placing the compass in her lap. Mama said Doc Henderson was scared you would be angry about the baby surviving when everyone thought it died. She was so sick for so long, and when she finally got better, you were already gone. She tried to find you, but people said you had vanished into the wilderness. The pieces of the story fell into place like cards in a deadly poker hand. Doc Henderson had been known for his drinking and for making mistakes when his hands shook too badly to hold surgical instruments steady. He probably panicked when Martha survived after he had already told Bear she was dead. She married Carlos when I was 3, Elena continued. He was a good man who loved us both, even though he knew I wasn't his real daughter. But Mama never stopped talking about you. She said someday, when I was old enough, I would find you again. Bear looked at his daughter, and he no longer had any doubt that's what she was, and saw Martha's stubborn determination mixed with his own green eyes. The shape of her face, the way she held her head when thinking, even the careful way she spoke, it was all achingly familiar. Why didn't she try harder to find me? The question came out harsher than he intended. 20 years of hurt and loneliness bleeding through his words. Elena's expression grew sad. She was sick, Papa. Not the kind of sick that kills you right away, but the kind that makes you weak and tired all the time. And she was scared that maybe you had found someone else, or that you wouldn't want a daughter who reminded you of losing her. Bear reached out and gently touched Elena's cheek, marveling at the softness of her skin. I never found anyone else, and I never stopped missing her. I know, Elena said simply. She said you would still be alone when I found you. She said men like you only love once, but they love forever. They sat together in the dusty street as the sun began to sink toward the western mountains. Bear's mind was reeling with questions, but for now it was enough to simply be near this miracle child who had somehow found her way back to him. Finally, Elena stood up and brushed the dirt off her patched dress. Are we going home now? Home. Bear looked at his daughter and realized that for the first time in 20 years, the word actually meant something again. Yes, he said, getting to his feet and offering her his hand. We're going home. As they finished loading their supplies into the wagon, Bear caught sight of several townspeople watching them with curious expressions. Word would spread quickly about the strange conversation they had just witnessed. By tomorrow, everyone in Broken Creek would be talking about how the hermit mountain man had claimed the orphan girl as his own daughter. Let them talk. Bear had spent 2 decades caring too much about what other people thought, and it had cost him everything that mattered. He helped Elena climb into the wagon seat, then swung up beside her. The old draft horse he had purchased that morning snorted and stamped its feet, eager to get moving before the weather changed. How far is it to your cabin? Elena asked, settling the wooden horse named Estrella carefully in her lap. About 2 weeks if the weather holds, Bear replied, picking up the reins. It's up in the mountains, pretty far from any other people. Will you be okay with that? Elena nodded seriously. Mama said you always liked quiet places. She said you could hear things in the silence that other people missed. As they rolled out of Broken Creek, Bear found himself stealing glances at his daughter. Every few minutes, some new detail would catch his attention. The way she tucked her hair behind her left ear, just like Martha used to do. Or how she hummed softly under her breath while watching the scenery. The road ahead was rough and winding, climbing steadily into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Bear knew they would face challenges in the weeks ahead: cold weather, difficult terrain, and his own failing health. But for the first time since Martha's supposed death, he felt like he had a reason to keep fighting. Papa. Elena's voice broke into his thoughts. Yes, Mama left something for you. She made me promise to give it to you when we were alone. Elena reached into the small pocket of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellow with age and soft from being handled many times. Bear's hands shook as he took the letter. Martha's handwriting was exactly as he remembered, careful and precise, with little flourishes on the capital letters. He could read the first few words even without unfolding it. My dearest Jeremiah. She wrote it right before she died, Elena explained quietly. She said it would help you understand everything. Bear carefully tucked the letter into his coat pocket, next to his heart. Some things were too precious to rush through. He would read Martha's final words when he was ready to hear them, probably tonight, by the fire, when Elena was asleep, and he could grieve privately for all the lost years. The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically as they climbed higher into the mountains. Behind them, Broken Creek disappeared into the valley, and ahead lay the unknown wilderness that Bear had called home for so long. But now, he wasn't going home alone. Now he was bringing his daughter back to the place where her parents had once planned to raise her together. It felt like completing a circle that had been broken for far too long. "Are you excited to see where you're going to live?" Bear asked as they crested a small hill. Elena considered the question seriously. "I think so. Mama always said, home isn't really about the place, it's about the people who love you. So I guess anywhere you are will feel like home to me." Bear felt his throat tighten with emotion. This wise, brave little girl had been through more hardship in her short life than most adults ever faced, yet she still had room in her heart for hope and trust. "Elena," he said quietly, "I want you to know that no matter what happens, you're safe now. I'm going to take care of you." She smiled and reached over to pat his arm with one small hand. "I know, Papa. I've been waiting my whole life for you to find me." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Bear McKenna drove his wagon toward home with his daughter beside him. For the first time in 20 years, the future looked like something worth living for. The crackling campfire painted dancing shadows across Elena's face as she carefully stirred a pot of beans with a wooden spoon. 3 days into their journey toward Bear's mountain cabin, she had already proven herself surprisingly capable for such a young child. While Bear tended to their horse and gathered firewood, Elena managed their simple meals with the quiet competence of someone who had learned early to be useful. Bear watched her from across their small camp, still struggling to believe this was real. Every morning he woke up expecting to find that Elena had been a fever dream, brought on by his illness, but there she was, humming softly while she worked, her dark hair catching the firelight. "The beans are ready," she announced, ladling the simple stew into 2 tin bowls. "Mama taught me to cook when I was little. She said a person should always know how to feed themselves." Bear accepted his bowl gratefully, noting how Elena had given him the larger portion despite her own obvious hunger. Everything about this child spoke of someone who had learned to put others' needs before her own. "Tell me about your life with Carlos," Bear said gently, settling back against his saddle. "Was he good to you?" Elena's face brightened. "Oh yes, Papa Carlos was wonderful. He taught me how to carve wood. That's how I got Estrella." She held up her wooden horse, running her fingers over its smooth surface. "He said every child should have something beautiful that was made just for them." Bear felt a pang of something that might have been jealousy, followed immediately by gratitude. Carlos Martinez had been the father Elena needed when Bear wasn't there to fill that role. "He sounds like a good man." "He was, but he wasn't my real papa." Elena looked directly at Bear with those unsettling green eyes. "Mama made sure I always knew the difference. She said Carlos chose to love me, but you loved me before I was even born." The words hit Bear like a physical blow. He had to look away, staring into the fire to hide the tears that threatened to spill down his cheeks. "Papa." Elena's voice was small and uncertain. "Did I say something wrong?" Bear cleared his throat roughly. "No, sweetheart. You said something very right. It's hard for me to hear about all the years I missed with you." Elena set down her bowl and moved closer to him, settling against his side like a small bird seeking warmth. "Mama said you would feel sad about that, but she also said the time we have now is more important than the time that's already gone." Bear wrapped his arm around his daughter, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his ribs. For a moment, the consumption in his chest seemed to quiet, as if even the disease recognized the healing power of this connection. "Your mama was a smart woman," he said softly. "She was scared, too," Elena admitted, especially at the end. "She was worried about what would happen to me after she died. Papa Carlos tried to take care of me, but then he got hurt in the mine and—" "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." Elena shook her head. "I want to," Mama said. "Keeping sad things locked up inside makes them grow bigger and scarier. Papa Carlos got crushed by falling rocks. The other miners tried to dig him out, but it was too late. After that, I stayed with different families in town. But nobody really wanted another mouth to feed. Bear's arm tightened around her. The thought of his daughter being passed from family to family like an unwanted burden made his blood boil. "That's all over now," he said firmly. "You're with me, and that's not going to change." Elena tilted her head to look up at him. "Even when you get sicker?" The question caught Bear off guard. He had been trying to hide the worst of his symptoms, but clearly Elena was more observant than he had given her credit for. "What do you mean?" "I've seen sick people before, Papa. The way you cough sometimes, and how tired you get after walking for a while. Mama was sick like that too, toward the end." Elena's voice was matter-of-fact, but Bear could hear the fear underneath. "Are you going to die and leave me alone again?" Bear stared into the fire, wrestling with how much truth a 6-year-old could handle. Finally, he decided that Elena had already faced enough lies and half-truths in her short life. "I am sick," he admitted. "There's something wrong with my lungs, and it's getting worse. The doctor said I might not have very long left." Elena was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When she spoke, her voice was steady but determined. "Then we need to make every day count." Bear looked down at his daughter, amazed by her resilience. Another child might have cried or begged him to get better. Elena simply accepted the situation and started planning for it. "Is that why you bought me at the auction?" she asked. "Because you wanted someone to take care of you while you're sick?" "No," Bear said quickly. "I bought you because something about you reminded me of someone I used to love very much. I didn't know you were my daughter then." "But you're glad I am?" Bear hugged her tighter. "Elena, finding out you're my daughter is the best thing that's happened to me in 20 years. I just wish we had more time together." Elena reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Maybe we do." Bear frowned as she opened the pouch to reveal a collection of dried herbs and roots. "What's that?" "Medicine. Mama made it before she died. She said it was for when I found you, in case you were sick." Elena's fingers moved through the herbs with practiced ease. "This is willow bark for pain, and pine needles for chest troubles, and wild cherry bark for coughs. Mama was really good with plant medicine." Bear stared at the herbs in amazement. Even beyond the grave, Martha was still trying to take care of him. "Do you know how to use these?" Elena nodded seriously. "Mama taught me. She said healers run in our family, and that I would need to know how to help people." She looked up at Bear, with hope shining in her eyes. "It might not cure you, but it could make you feel better. Maybe strong enough to last until spring." Bear felt something shift in his chest, not the familiar pain of the consumption, but something warmer and more hopeful. Spring was still months away, but with Elena's help, maybe he could make it that far. Maybe they could have a few precious months together before. He pushed the dark thoughts away. Elena was right. They needed to make every day count. "All right," he said, settling her more comfortably against his side. "Tomorrow you can show me how to make your mama's medicine. Tonight, why don't you tell me more about her? I want to hear everything." Elena's face lit up with joy. "Really? You want to hear about all the things she used to say about you?" "Every single word." As Elena began to talk, her voice soft and musical in the firelight, Bear found himself transported back in time. Through his daughter's stories, Martha came alive again, not the idealized memory he had carried for 20 years, but the real woman, with her quirks and fears and dreams. Elena told him about the songs Martha used to sing while cooking, and how she would dance around their small cabin when she thought no one was watching. She described Martha's herb garden and her habit of talking to plants as if they were old friends. She shared memories of quiet evenings when Martha would brush Elena's hair and tell stories about the brave mountain man who would someday come back to them. She never stopped believing you would find each other again, Elena said as her voice began to grow sleepy. Even when Papa Carlos would say it was time to stop waiting and move on, Mama would just smile and say that some loves are stronger than time or distance. Bear felt tears rolling down his cheeks, but for once they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude for Martha's faith, for Elena's existence, and for this second chance he never thought he would have. As his daughter's breathing grew deep and even against his side, Bear looked up at the star-filled sky and made a silent promise. Whatever time he had left, he would use it to give Elena the father she deserved. He would teach her everything he knew about surviving in the wilderness, about reading the signs in nature, about finding beauty in simple things. And maybe, if he was very lucky, she would remember him with the same love and pride that she remembered Martha. The fire crackled lower as Bear carefully adjusted Elena's position so she could sleep more comfortably. Tomorrow, they would continue their journey toward home, armed now with Martha's medicine and the knowledge that miracles sometimes came disguised as small girls with green eyes and wooden horses. Bear McKenna had spent 20 years believing he was a man with nothing left to live for. Tonight, he was discovering that sometimes the best reasons for living came when you least expected them. The howling started just after midnight, cutting through the November darkness like knives through silk. Bear McKenna's eyes snapped open in their makeshift camp, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle beside his bedroll. 6 days into their mountain journey, they had entered territory where civilization was just a memory, and nature ruled with tooth and claw. Elena stirred beside him, her small body pressed close for warmth under the shared blankets. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and their campfire had burned down to glowing embers that barely held back the pressing darkness. Another howl echoed through the pine trees, closer this time. Then another, from a different direction. Bear's blood turned to ice water as he recognized the sound wolves, and not just one or two, a whole pack, hunting together in the bitter cold. "Papa?" Elena's whisper was barely audible above the wind. "What's that noise?" Bear kept his voice calm, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Wolves, sweetheart. They're probably just passing through, looking for deer or elk." But even as he said the words, Bear knew they were in serious trouble. November was hunting season for wolves, when they needed to pack on weight before the worst of winter arrived. A man and a small child, alone in the wilderness, would look like easy prey to hungry predators. Elena sat up, clutching her wooden horse against her chest. In the dim light of the dying fire, her green eyes reflected a wisdom far beyond her 6 years. "They're circling us, aren't they?" Bear nodded grimly. His daughter was too smart to lie to, and she would need to understand the danger if they were going to survive the night. "How many do you think there are?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite the fear Bear could see in her eyes. Bear listened carefully to the howls echoing through the forest. "Maybe 6 or 7, possibly more." The pack was using classic hunting tactics, surrounding their prey, cutting off escape routes, wearing down their victims through fear and exhaustion. Bear had seen it happen to elk and deer, but never thought he would be on the receiving end. He reached for more wood to build up their fire, but his hand closed on empty air. In his illness-clouded thinking, he had failed to gather enough fuel to last the night. The few remaining pieces would burn for maybe another hour, and then they would be in complete darkness. "Elena," he said quietly, "I need you to listen very carefully. Stay close to the fire, and don't move unless I tell you to. No matter what happens, don't run. Wolves chase things that run." Elena nodded, her small fingers white-knuckled around Estrella. "What are you going to do?" Bear checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. "I'm going to try to scare them off. Most wolves won't attack humans unless they're desperate." But Bear knew these wolves were desperate. The early winter had been harsh, driving their usual prey deeper into the mountains. A pack this size, hunting this close to human territory, meant they were willing to take risks they normally wouldn't consider. Yellow eyes appeared at the edge of their firelight, just pinpricks of reflected flame, but enough to make Bear's skin crawl. The wolves were testing their defenses, looking for weaknesses. Bear stood slowly, raising his rifle toward the eyes. "Get back!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. "Go on! Get out of here!" The eyes disappeared, but Bear could hear the soft padding of paws on frozen ground. The pack was regrouping, planning their next move. Elena suddenly stood up, still holding her wooden horse. "Papa," Maybe we're thinking about this wrong. What do you mean? Bear kept his eyes on the darkness beyond their camp, watching for movement. Mama used to say that most fights happen because both sides are scared of each other. Maybe the wolves are just as afraid of us as we are of them. Bear almost smiled despite their desperate situation. Even facing death, his daughter was trying to find a peaceful solution. Sweetheart, I don't think we can talk our way out of this one. But Elena wasn't listening. She had begun to hum the same soft, haunting melody Bear had heard her sing during their journey. The tune seemed to float through the cold air like smoke, weaving between the pine trees and settling over their camp like a blanket. The effect was immediate and impossible to explain. The padding footsteps around their camp slowed, then stopped entirely. Even the wind seemed to quiet, as if the whole forest was listening to Elena's strange song. Bear stared at his daughter in amazement. She stood perfectly still beside the dying fire, her voice clear and pure in the darkness. The melody had no words, but it seemed to speak directly to something primal and peaceful in the night. One by one, shapes began to emerge from the shadows, not attacking or stalking, but simply approaching. Bear counted 6 wolves, then 7, their heads lowered and their tails relaxed. The lead wolf, a massive gray male with scars across his muzzle, padded slowly toward Elena, his yellow eyes fixed on her face. Bear's finger tightened on his rifle trigger, but something made him hesitate. There was no aggression in the wolf's posture, no sign of the predatory tension that had filled the air moments before. Elena's song continued, rising and falling like the wind through mountain passes. The lead wolf stopped just outside the ring of firelight and slowly lay down, resting his massive head on his paws. One by one, the other wolves followed suit, settling into the snow in a loose circle around their camp. When Elena's song finally ended, the silence was complete, except for the soft breathing of wolves and humans sharing the same small space under the stars. "How?" Bear whispered, his voice full of wonder. Elena smiled, the first truly carefree expression he had seen on her face since the auction. "Mama taught me that music is the language of hearts. She said wild things understand it better than people do, because they listen with their whole selves instead of just their ears." The lead wolf raised his head and looked directly at Elena, his ancient eyes holding what Bear could only describe as respect. Then, as silently as they had appeared, the pack rose and melted back into the forest, leaving only paw prints in the snow to prove they had ever been there. Bear sank to his knees beside the fire, his rifle forgotten. "Elena, I've never seen anything like that in 30 years of living in these mountains." Elena settled back down beside him, tucking Estrella carefully under her blanket. "Mama said I had a gift with animals. She said they could hear something in my voice that most people couldn't." Bear shook his head in amazement. His daughter was full of surprises, each one more remarkable than the last. First, the herbal medicine that had already begun to ease his coughing, and now this impossible ability to calm wild creatures with nothing but her voice. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked. "I didn't learn it anywhere," Elena replied, yawning as exhaustion finally caught up with her. "It just comes to me when I need it, like the words to prayers or the way you know which direction is home." As Elena drifted off to sleep against his side, Bear stared into the darkness where the wolves had disappeared. He had always considered himself a practical man, not given to believing in magic or miracles, but tonight had shaken that worldview to its core. Maybe there were forces in the world that couldn't be explained by logic or experience. Maybe his daughter carried something special inside her, a gift that came from Martha's gentle spirit, or from some deeper source that Bear had never imagined. Whatever it was, it had just saved their lives. Bear added the last of their firewood to the flames and settled in for what remained of the night. Tomorrow they would reach the higher elevations where winter hit hardest, and he needed to be ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. But tonight, for the first time since Elena had entered his life, Bear allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it home after all. The fire crackled peacefully, as father and daughter slept under a canopy of stars, protected by forces they didn't understand, but no longer question. The blizzard struck without warning on their 10th day of travel, transforming the mountain landscape into a white hell of howling wind and driving snow. Bear McKenna pulled his coat tighter around Elena as they huddled behind their overturned wagon, using it as a windbreak against the storm that had appeared out of nowhere. What had started as light flurries that morning had become a full-scale winter assault by afternoon. The temperature had plummeted so fast that their water barrel had frozen solid, and visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet in any direction. "Papa, I can't feel my toes," Elena said through chattering teeth, pressed close against Bear's side under their shared blankets. Bear flexed his own numb fingers, trying to restore circulation. The storm had caught them in an exposed section of trail with no natural shelter, forcing them to abandon their wagon and seek what protection they could find. Their horse had broken free during the initial chaos and disappeared into the white void, taking most of their supplies with it. "We need to find better shelter," Bear said, his voice barely audible above the wind. This storm could last for days. But even as he spoke, Bear knew their situation was desperate. The consumption in his lungs had worsened during their journey, and the bitter cold was making it even harder to breathe. Each cough brought up blood now, staining the snow around their makeshift camp. Elena pulled her small leather pouch of herbs from her dress pocket. "Maybe we should make some of Mama's medicine. It might help your breathing." Bear shook his head. "We can't risk melting snow for water. It would take too much heat, and we barely have enough firewood to last through the night." Their fire built from broken wagon boards, and what dry wood they could find was their only lifeline in the storm. Without it, they would freeze to death within hours. But the wind kept trying to extinguish the flames, and Bear was running out of fuel to keep it going. Elena studied their dire situation with the practical wisdom of someone who had faced hardship before. "What about that?" She pointed to a dark shadow barely visible through the swirling snow. "Could that be a cave?" Bear squinted through the storm, trying to make out what Elena had spotted. It did look like there might be an opening in the rock face about 50 yards away, but reaching it would mean leaving their fire and wagon, gambling everything on the hope that shelter existed. "It's too risky," Bear decided. "We could get lost in the storm and freeze before we found our way back." But Elena was already moving, gathering their most essential supplies into a small bundle. "Papa, we're going to freeze here anyway. At least if we try, we might find somewhere warmer." Bear wanted to argue, but another violent coughing fit seized him, leaving him weak and gasping. When it passed, he found Elena kneeling beside him with snow in her hands, using it to clean the blood from his beard. "You're getting sicker," she said simply. "The cold air is making it worse. We need to find somewhere protected from the wind." Bear looked at his 6-year-old daughter and marveled at her courage. While he was paralyzed by fear and illness, she was thinking clearly and making logical decisions. Martha would have been proud of their child's strength. "All right," he said finally, "but we stay connected. I'll tie a rope around both our waists so we don't get separated." Using a length of rope from their wagon harness, Bear created a lifeline between them. Elena insisted on carrying their small bag of supplies, leaving Bear free to focus on navigating through the storm. The 50-yard journey felt like crossing an entire continent. The wind howled around them with demonic fury, driving ice crystals into their faces like tiny needles. Bear could barely see Elena, even though she was only 6 feet away, connected to him by the rope. But Elena had been right about the shadow. It was indeed a cave, not large, but deep enough to provide real shelter from the storm. Bear collapsed just inside the entrance, his lungs burning from the effort of walking through knee-deep snow. "Papa!" Elena's voice echoed in the small space, as she helped him sit up against the cave wall. "Can you breathe?" Bear nodded weakly, though each breath felt like swallowing broken glass. The cave was warmer than the open air, but still cold enough that their breath came out in visible puffs. Elena immediately set to work with the efficiency of someone twice her age. She gathered dry leaves and debris from the cave floor to create a small fire pit, then used Bear's flint and steel to coax flames from their dwindling supply of tinder. "Where did you learn to do that?" Bear asked, amazed by her skill. "Papa Carlos taught me. He said everyone should know how to make fire, because it's the difference between living and dying in the wilderness." Elena blew gently on the tiny flames, encouraging them to grow. He was right, wasn't he? Bear smiled despite their desperate situation. Carlos Martinez continued to help them even from beyond the grave, through the skills he had passed on to Elena. Once the fire was established, Elena pulled out her leather pouch of herbs. "Now we can make your medicine. The cave will hold the heat better than outside." She melted snow in their small tin cup, then added precise amounts of dried bark and leaves. As the mixture steeped, Elena hummed the same haunting melody that had calmed the wolves, and Bear found himself relaxing, despite their dire circumstances. "Drink this slowly," Elena instructed, handing him the warm cup. "Mama said it tastes terrible, but it works better than anything the doctors have." The medicine was indeed bitter, but within minutes, Bear could feel his breathing ease. The tightness in his chest loosened, and the constant urge to cough began to fade. "That's remarkable," he said, taking Elena's small hands in his larger ones. "Your mama was quite a healer." Elena smiled proudly, then grew serious again. "Papa, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you scared?" "About being sick, I mean." Bear considered lying, but Elena deserved honesty. "Yes, I am. Not so much about dying. I've lived a full life, but I'm scared about leaving you alone again." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "I'm scared too, but Mama always said being scared is okay, as long as you don't let it stop you from doing what needs to be done." "And what needs to be done now?" Elena looked around their small cave, calculating their resources with the practical mind of someone who had learned early that survival required planning. "We need to wait out the storm. We have fire, water from melting snow, and some food. The cave will protect us from the wind. And I have enough herbs to make medicine for several more days." Bear marveled at his daughter's resilience. 6 years old, stranded in a blizzard with a dying father. And she was making survival plans with the calm competence of an experienced mountain guide. "Elena," he said softly, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. You're braver and smarter than most grown men I've known." Elena's cheeks reddened, but she met his eyes directly. "Mama said I got my brains from her, and my stubborn streak from you. She said that combination would help me survive anything." As if summoned by her words, the wind outside the cave howled even louder, rattling loose rocks near the entrance. But inside their small shelter, warmed by fire and Martha's medicine, Bear felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Hope. Maybe they wouldn't make it to his cabin before winter truly set in. Maybe he wouldn't live to see spring. But sitting here with his remarkable daughter, watching her tend their fire with such competent care, Bear realized that he had already received more than he had any right to expect. He had found his child. He had learned that Martha's love had survived even death. And he had discovered that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as the greatest challenges. "Tell me more about your mama," Bear said, settling back against the cave wall. "I want to hear everything you remember." Elena's face lit up with joy, and she began to speak, her voice mixing with the sound of wind and crackling fire to create a symphony of memory and love that filled their small sanctuary with warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside their cave, a father and daughter shared stories and built bonds that no blizzard could ever break. The fever came like a wildfire in the night, consuming Bear McKenna's body with flames that no amount of snow could cool. 3 days trapped in their mountain cave had taken their toll, and now Elena knelt beside her father's burning form, watching him mumble words that made no sense, while his green eyes stared at things that weren't there. "Papa, can you hear me?" Elena whispered, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. The cloth warmed instantly against his skin, becoming useless within seconds. Bear's lips moved constantly, forming names and phrases from a past Elena could only guess at. Sometimes he called for Martha, his voice breaking with 20 years of buried grief. Other times, he seemed to be reliving old battles, his hands reaching for weapons that existed only in his fevered mind. Elena had been awake for 2 straight days, tending their fire and brewing medicine with the last of her herb. The storm outside had finally stopped, but fresh snow blocked the cave entrance so completely that only thin streams of daylight filtered through the gaps. "I don't know what to do," Elena said to Estrella, holding the wooden horse close to her chest. For the first time since finding her father, she felt truly helpless. All of Martha's remedies seemed powerless against this raging fever. Bear's breathing became shallow and rapid, each exhale a barely audible whistle. Elena pressed her ear to his chest and heard the terrible rattling sound that meant his lungs were filling with fluid. She had heard that same sound from Mama during her final days. "No," Elena said firmly, sitting up with sudden determination. "I won't let you leave me too." She began to sing not the wolf-calming melody from before, but something different. A song that seemed to come from deep inside her chest, wordless but full of love and desperate hope. As her voice filled the small cave, Bear's restless movements began to slow. Elena sang until her throat was raw, pouring every ounce of her will into the music. She sang about mountain streams and sunny meadows, about wooden horses and brass compasses, about a love so strong it could reach across death itself. Gradually, impossibly, Bear's fever began to break. His skin cooled under Elena's touch, and his breathing deepened. When his eyes finally opened, they were clear and focused for the first time in days. "Elena?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it was his own voice, not the fevered rambling of the past 3 days. Elena burst into tears, throwing her small arms around his neck. "I thought you were going to die. I thought you were going to leave me alone." Bear held his daughter close, marveling at the strength in her small body. "How long was I sick?" 3 days. You kept talking to people who weren't there, and your skin was so hot I could barely touch you." Elena pulled back to look at his face. "What made you better?" Bear considered the question seriously. The fever had been unlike anything he had ever experienced, a burning that seemed to come from his very soul, rather than just his body. But Elena's singing had somehow reached through the flames and pulled him back to the world of the living. "I think it was you," he said honestly. "Your voice. It was like a rope pulling me out of a dark place." Elena smiled through her tears. "Mama always said music could heal more than just bodies. She said it could heal hearts and spirits too." Bear struggled to sit up, surprised to find that his breathing was easier than it had been in months. The crushing weight in his chest had lifted, replaced by a strange sense of lightness he hadn't felt since before the consumption took hold. "Elena, I need to tell you something important." Bear took his daughter's hands in his own. "I don't think I'm going to die." Elena's eyes widened. "Really? The sickness is gone?" "Not gone," Bear said carefully, "but changed. Like it's sleeping instead of fighting. I can't explain it, but I feel stronger than I have in months." Elena considered this information with her usual seriousness. Maybe Mama's medicine finally had time to work properly. Or maybe, she trailed off, looking uncertain. Maybe what? Maybe I really do have a gift for healing, like Mama said. Maybe that's why I was supposed to find you. Bear studied his daughter's face in the firelight. There was something different about her now, an inner glow that hadn't been there before. During his fever, she had somehow reached deep inside herself and found power she didn't know she possessed. "Whatever happened," Bear said, "I'm grateful. We both are alive, and that's what matters." Elena nodded, then suddenly became practical again. "We need to dig our way out of here. The storm is over, and we should try to reach your cabin before another one comes." Bear looked toward the cave entrance, where packed snow blocked most of the opening. It would take hours of careful work to clear a path without causing a collapse, and they would have to do it with their bare hands and the few tools they had salvaged from the wagon. "That's going to be hard work for both of us," he warned. Elena stood up and brushed dust off her patched dress. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Papa. I've been doing it my whole life." As they began the slow process of digging through the snow barrier, Bear found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't dared to before. Maybe he would live to see spring, after all. Maybe he would have time to teach Elena all the things a father should teach his daughter. Maybe miracles really did happen to ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Papa? Elena's voice interrupted his thoughts. Yes? When we get to your cabin, will you teach me how to hunt and trap like you do? Bear smiled, picturing his small daughter learning to read animal tracks and set snares. If that's what you want to learn. It is. Mama always said I should know how to take care of myself, no matter what happened. And if you're going to live longer than we thought, I want to be able to help provide for us. Bear felt his throat tighten with emotion. 6 years old, and already thinking like a partner instead of just a child to be protected. Elena was going to grow up to be a remarkable woman, strong, capable, and completely unafraid of the challenges life might throw at her. Elena, he said, pausing in his digging, I want you to know that no matter what happens, whether I live for another month or another 20 years, finding you has been the greatest gift of my life. Elena smiled and reached over to squeeze his hand. Finding you has been pretty great too, Papa, even if you are kind of grumpy sometimes. Bear actually laughed, for the first time since Martha's supposed death 20 years ago. The sound echoed through their small cave like music, mixing with Elena's giggles to create a symphony of joy that no storm could ever silence. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, but neither father nor daughter noticed. They were too busy planning their future together, a future that suddenly seemed full of possibilities neither had dared to imagine just days before. Spring arrived early at Bear McKenna's mountain cabin, painting the meadow around his home with wildflowers that seemed to glow in the morning sunlight. Bear sat on his front porch, whittling a small wolf to accompany Elena's wooden horse, while his daughter played in the grass nearby, her laughter echoing across the valley like the sweetest music he had ever heard. 5 months had passed since they survived the blizzard in the cave, and the changes in both of them were remarkable. Elena had grown taller and stronger, her face filling out with the healthy glow of a child who was well-fed and deeply loved. Her dark hair now hung in neat braids that Bear had learned to make himself, complete with small wooden beads he carved during quiet evenings. Bear's own transformation was even more dramatic. The consumption that had been slowly killing him seemed to have retreated into some quiet corner of his chest, barely noticeable except during the coldest mornings. Martha's herbal remedies, combined with Elena's mysterious healing gift, had given him something he thought was impossible time. Papa, look what I found! Elena called out, running toward him with her hands cupped around something precious. Bear set down his carving as Elena approached, her green eyes sparkling with excitement. She carefully opened her hands to reveal a tiny bird with a broken wing, its small body trembling with fear and pain. Can we fix him? Elena asked, her voice full of hope and determination. Bear examined the injured creature gently. The wing was clearly broken, but not too badly. With careful tending, the bird might fly again. We can try, he said, but it will take patience and very gentle care. Elena nodded seriously. Mama always said that healing takes time, but love makes it possible. As Elena prepared a small nest for the injured bird, Bear marveled at how naturally caregiving came to her. Over the winter months, she had helped him nurse several wounded animals back to health, a rabbit caught in a trap, an owl with a damaged eye, even a young deer that had fallen into a ravine. Each time, Elena seemed to know exactly what the animal needed. Her hands moved with instinctive knowledge, and her voice carried that special quality that made wild creatures trust her completely. Bear had stopped questioning the gift and simply accepted it as part of who his daughter was. There, Elena said, settling the bird into a nest made from soft moss and rabbit fur. Now he needs to rest and get strong. Bear smiled at her confidence. And how do you know it's a he? Elena tilted her head thoughtfully. He told me, not with words, but, you know, the way animals talk when you really listen. Bear did know, though he still didn't fully understand it. Elena's connection to the natural world was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. Sometimes he caught her having what seemed like conversations with the squirrels and chipmunks around their cabin, complete with pauses, as if she was listening to responses only she could hear. "Elena," Bear said, settling back into his chair, "do you ever miss living in town? Around other people?" Elena considered the question while gently stroking the injured bird's feathers. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to have friends my own age, but I love it here, Papa. The mountains feel like home, in a way nowhere else ever has." Bear felt a familiar tightness in his throat. Over the winter, he had worried that Elena might feel lonely, living so far from other children. But she seemed genuinely content with their simple life, finding endless fascination in the changing seasons and the wildlife around their cabin. "What about when you get older?" Bear asked. "Don't you want to learn things I can't teach you? Reading and writing? Maybe music lessons?" Elena's face brightened. "You've been teaching me to read using Mama's old books." And as for music, she began to hum the melody that had calmed the wolves, then added words he had never heard before. "Mountain high and valley low, love will find the way to go. Through the darkness, through the light, hearts connected burning bright." Bear stared at his daughter in amazement. "Where did those words come from?" "I don't know," Elena admitted. "They just appeared in my head while I was humming, like they were always there, waiting for the right moment." Bear shook his head in wonder. Every day brought some new surprise, some fresh evidence that Elena was extraordinary in ways he was still discovering. "Papa," Elena said suddenly, "I've been thinking about something important." "What's that?" Elena set the bird's nest carefully aside and came to sit on the porch step beside Bear's chair. "I want to visit Mama's grave. I think it's time we went together." Bear felt his chest tighten, but not with the old pain of grief. This was something different, a mixture of sadness and anticipation, fear and healing, all tangled together. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" he asked. Elena nodded firmly. "I've been carrying her memory inside me for my whole life, but I want to share it with you properly. I want to tell her that we found each other, just like she always said we would." Bear looked out across the meadow, toward the forest where Martha's grave lay hidden among the trees. He had avoided that place for 20 years, unable to face the reminder of his loss. But Elena was right, it was time. "All right," he said, standing up and offering her his hand. "Let's go see your mama." They walked together through the forest, Elena chattering about the flowers she wanted to pick, and the stories she planned to tell Martha about their winter adventures. Bear listened with half his attention, while the other half wrestled with emotions he had kept buried for 2 decades. The clearing where Martha's grave lay was exactly as Bear remembered it, except that someone had been caring for it. Fresh wildflowers adorned the simple wooden cross, and the area around the grave was free of weeds and debris. "You've been coming here," Bear said, not really asking. Elena nodded. "Every few weeks since the snow melted. I wanted to make sure it stayed beautiful for when you were ready to visit." Bear knelt beside the weathered cross, running his fingers over the carved letters of Martha's name. "Hello, my love," he whispered. "I brought someone to see you." Elena knelt beside him and began arranging the fresh flowers she had picked along their walk. As she worked, she talked to Martha as naturally as if she were having a conversation with a living person. "Mama, this is Papa, your Jeremiah. Isn't he wonderful? He's been taking such good care of me, just like you said he would. And he's not sick anymore." "Not really. I think you had something to do with that." Bear felt tears rolling down his cheeks as Elena continued her one-sided conversation, sharing details about their cabin, their animal friends, and all the things Bear had taught her during their months together. "And Mama," Elena concluded, "Papa loves you just as much as he always did. I can see it in his eyes whenever he talks about you. You don't have to worry about us anymore. We're a real family now, and we're going to take care of each other forever." Bear reached over and took Elena's small hand in his larger one. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For bringing me back to life. for showing me that love doesn't end when someone dies, it just changes form and keeps growing." Elena smiled and leaned against his shoulder. "Mama always said you were worth waiting for. I think she was right." As they sat together in the dappled sunlight, surrounded by the peace of the forest and the eternal presence of love that transcends death, Bear McKenna realized that his life had finally come full circle. He had found his daughter, healed from his illness, and made peace with his past. More importantly, he had learned that worth isn't measured in gold or years, but in the connections we make and the love we choose to give and receive. A dying mountain man and a little girl at an auction had found each other against impossible odds, proving that some bonds are stronger than time, distance, or even death itself. The future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibilities and filled with the promise of more adventures, more healing, and more love than either had dared to dream possible. Elena was right. They were a real family now. And families, Bear had learned, were the greatest treasures of all.